exceptionally exciting podcast and interview today. And not because of the podcast itself, it's because who the guest is. I am absolutely thrilled and honoured to have Wesley J Smith join us. If, as a follower of Family Matters, you don't know who Wesley is, shame on you. Wesley is an amazing individual. There we go. There's the introduction, Wesley. Wesley J Smith is the chair and the senior fellow at the Discovery Institute's Centre on Human Exceptionalism. He's trained in law. He's a philosopher. He's expert in the areas of bioethics. He's a writer, a prolific writer, and a commentator. Wesley, I think you've been on just about every show in America and now here in New Zealand. So welcome.
Well, thank you very much, and hello to New Zealand.
We're going to have to get you down here sometime. You were telling me off air you've only transited through the airport.
Yes, I've been in Auckland Airport. I was locked in. They wouldn't let me out because I was heading to Australia.
All right. Seems to be a bit of a rule here. If you're heading to Australia, we're not letting you in here. No, only joking.
I did see some sheep on the mountainside, though. That was nice.
There's a walking stereotype with four legs.
Yeah.
Wesley, look, thank you so much for coming along. As I was introducing, you really do have a formidable, in the best sense of that word, background and area of expertise around, well, many, if not all, the bioethical issues. So we'll certainly touch on all of them. And as we're getting ready to record as well, you had noted on social media that a mountain here in New Zealand has become a legal person. So I think we should delve into all of that. But I wonder if we could start around this concept of human exceptionalism. You've spoken, written, and talked to this quite a bit. So I think viewers would like to delve a bit deeper. What do you mean by human exceptionalism?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity. Human exceptionalism is a term I don't think I coined, but I'm trying to popularize, that sets forth the unique dignity and importance of being human. And this has two aspects. One is the value of our lives, which is unquantifiable. But the other, and so people might say, well, why not just say sanctity of life? Well, that's not all it is, because we are also moral agents. We have duties. We have obligations. We understand right from wrong. So it's both the natural rights that humans should have as unique in the known universe, plus carrying out our proper obligations, not only to each other, but also to proper environmental practices, humane treatment of animals, and so forth.
So it seems to me that the difference when we talk between, be it animals, humans, or even, an entity like a mountain, that the difference that you're pushing is that humans are moral. We're moral creatures, whereas I assume animals, mountains are not.
Yes, of course, geological features like a mountain are inanimate. I mean, in the sense that they are insentient. Animals, of course, are aware of things and so forth, but they're not moral. They're amoral. And the difference might be there was a killing in one of our aquariums several years ago. A orca took the trainer and pulled her underwater and killed her. Now, if I had done that, that would be a foul murder. But the orca can't be accused of doing anything immoral because the orca was just being an orca. So you can't charge animals with crimes. You can't charge that new mountain with crimes if there's an avalanche and someone gets hurt. Humans are unique in this capacity, the understanding of right and wrong, moral agencies, duties towards each other. And I often am asked, for example, by animal rights folk, they'll say, well, just human exceptionalism means that you can do whatever you want to animals. And I repeatedly say, no, that's not true. We have the obligation to treat animals humanely. But then I will say, but if being human in and of itself isn't what gives us the obligations to treat animals humanely, then what does? And they never have an answer because we're human. And why is that? Because we're exceptional.
And I would add, well, not add, actually, that's a presumption speaking to a man of your expertise, but it's precisely because we're moral that we actually have an obligation and duty to that which is amoral. As you say, the animals, they just want to eat, they just want to reproduce, they want to do whatever they want to do.
And they have emotions and so forth. They can feel pain. That matters.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, what do you say then to those people who say, well, we're just really animals too, we're just another species, all this moral creation is, well, literally, that's just a creation. Surely animals can do the same.
Well, then that's grounds for all kinds of tyranny, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, if you want to reduce human life to just a bunch of carbon molecules, you can do that. But it leads to nihilism, and it leads to the kind of horrors we've seen in previous centuries in terms of tyranny and authoritarianism, murder, genocide, and so forth. Being human matters. Taking care of each other and treating each other as equals matters. And if it doesn't, then the whole concept of universal human rights gets thrown out the window.
And we begin to see, as you say, not only the horrors, particularly in the 20th century, where we have people as other, but I would argue, and feel free to push back too, but in the bioethical space, you hear it at the start of life, oh, it's just a clump of cells, there's no humanity. And we've seen at the end of life as well, where it's, oh, well, it's just suffering of a species, of an animal we should terminate. And you go, whoa, guys, why don't we move away from these moral concepts?
Yeah, the problem with bioethics, the mainstream view, not every bioethicist, of course, if you say Catholic in front of the term bioethicist, chances are they won't think like this. But the mainstream view in bioethics, the Peter Singer type approach, the utilitarianish view, is not that a human being is a person, but that some human beings are non-persons. And non-persons in this bioethical construct, which I think is very dangerous, then have less value than persons and can be used instrumentally. And you've even seen some bioethicists saying that we should use disabled human beings, cognitively disabled human beings, for example, in the same way we might animals. And also people like Peter Singer, the formerly Princeton, and he's an Australian moral philosopher, just retired from Princeton, saying that infanticide is okay because a baby is not a person, or that it was okay to end the life of Terry Schiavo, the woman who was severely cognitively disabled, because she lost her personhood. Well, you know, if you, as a human being, have to begin to earn your value, then no one is safe. Human exceptionalism, on the other hand, says we matter equally simply and merely because we're human. It's an objective criterion, not a subjective criterion, because when it becomes subjective, then who counts and who doesn't, who matters and who doesn't, who lives and who dies can become a matter of who has the power to decide.
This is why you're the expert in this space. For me, as someone who's studied and worked in this area for a long time, to hear your articulation of this is just fantastic. Because, as you say, it's just the fact that you are human. Instantly, there are these rights and these exceptionalisms, if you will. Right.
Otherwise, we might as well throw universal human rights onto the rocks, because that's the only way you're going to be able to sustain it philosophically and logically.
And also will just lead you into power dynamics. Who becomes the more powerful to assert the human rights, in inverted commas, on this group or not? And I'm very familiar, unfortunately, with the works of Peter Singer. There's a horrid consistency to his thinking, but it leads to such horrific outcomes. And just for viewers to understand, he is quite happy with infanticide up to a certain age, because is it based on rationality in particular, if I recall correctly?
Right, and he thinks that people can lose their personhood. One of the nice things about Singer, though, is when his mother had Alzheimer's disease, and in his view would have had lesser value as a human being, he still made sure she was taken care of. And he was asked in a magazine interview once, well, what about that? And he said, well, it's different when it's your mother. So apparently, at least in some way, he was raised right.
I think so. Well, but there's also illustrates a very important and moral element of being human. It's not just that we have relations, obviously, with I always say we're born into relationship, obviously, son to mother, son to father in the wider community. But our humanity implies a moral, I'd say, imperative that we actually think of everyone else in that same relational and human way, hence not taking away qualities from them, which leads, as we say, to those disasters so awfully manifest. So
yes, I quite agree with that.
So from your perspective, I mean, there's a wonderful simplicity to the idea of humanity, and yet so many philosophers, bioethicists, and others complicate it, I would say, from what you've articulated. But let's see if we can root that in one particular topic, and that's euthanasia. You've been a very strong advocate against euthanasia and constructing a series of arguments of why. So for viewers here, because New Zealand is reviewing its euthanasia laws. We have euthanasia here. They're wanting to expand it further. They want to get rid of conscience rights of doctors. Oh, absolutely. So lay out the 101 or the basic case of why, from a human exceptionalist approach and your bioethical background, of why euthanasia is the wrong choice.
Because you're actually engaging in the killing of human beings in a private way, whether by doctors or whether by someone else. If you decide that killing is an acceptable answer to human suffering, then there will be no limit to the kind of killing that will eventually be allowed, because suffering is a very subjective issue. In fact, most of the laws that you see written, they will not even try to create an objective objective criteria as to what would constitute suffering. It's how the person who wants to die perceives it. And if you have a illness that at that time qualifies you for either assisted suicide or euthanasia, lethal jab, and you ask to die, they won't give you suicide prevention. So let's say I'm on a bridge and I'm ready to jump. And someone comes up and says to me, Wesley, no, there's another way. Life can be worth living again. Let us help you. And I say, well, but I have cancer. Oh, well, let us hold your coat. What are you telling the person with cancer about the value of their lives? You're confirming their worst fears. And the very interesting thing is that in most of the statistics I've seen, whether it's in Oregon assisted suicide, Netherlands, Belgium, Canada, and so forth, the reason people ask to be killed or for suicide isn't pain. That's very rarely. It's existential concerns, worries about being a burden, worries about losing the ability to engage in enjoyable activities, worries about losing dignity. These are important issues that need to be dealt with. And in a human exceptionalist manner, you embrace that person, you include that person, you help that person find their way through the darkness. And there are a lot of people who were suicidal and receive that kind of intervention, some sick, some perhaps not sick, who are so glad they didn't kill themselves. I've met people with terminal illnesses who became suicidal, and then when they didn't get assisted suicide, were glad to still be alive. You are not meaning too often with regard to euthanasia and assisted suicide. You think you're being compassionate, but compassion means to suffer with. Assisted suicide and euthanasia is abandonment. And if you decide that eliminating suffering is the primary purpose of society, and that's where a lot of us have gone, that very quickly mutates into eliminating the sufferer. And as we've seen in Canada, Netherlands, Belgium, and other places, once you start down that road, it continues to expand and grow further. People would say, well, that's slippery slope argumentation. When I started making that argument 30 years ago. Now it's facts on the ground, because you can see it in country after country after country and in jurisdiction after jurisdiction after jurisdiction.
You're 100% correct. It's the exact, experience here in New Zealand. We're just over 3 years of euthanasia now. And my philosophical training, possibly like yours, said never use slippery slope arguments. So I just started talking about the cliff. There's no slippery slope. There's just a cliff. Once you've accepted the notion that suffering should allow for death, then we just see the natural expansion. As we are here in New Zealand, we're looking to increase the range of conditions, even the element of mental health, of course, just like Canada has been raised. Then they're raising issues around the competency of children.
That's because we're logical people, a logical species. And it's interesting that the activists who promise, so sincerely, that protective guidelines will prevent abuse, as soon as it's legal, the very same guidelines that they said were going to be so protective are redefined as barriers and obstacles to a good death. So I will charge most assisted suicide advocates of disingenuous advocacy, because they don't intend to leave it to the few. They want to normalize it and make it available to the many.
Well, I would make the argument, and by the way, you are far more expert in this, so push back and tell me I'm wrong, but there's almost this transhumanist element here that we want to move beyond what we understand ourselves as human. And if I want to change who I am, which obviously brings us into gender issues, or I just want to end my life, should be allowed to do so. It's a redefinition, a movement away from our traditional view of what it means to be human. And I think these radical pro-death people are more than happy for the 16-year-old on the bridge to end their life if that's what they wanted.
Well, certainly somebody like Philip Nitschke, the Australian Dr. Death, has actually said that. He in a interview in National Review back, in 2001, he said that he wanted to see the peaceful pill, which is a suicide pill, sold in supermarkets and available to troubled teens. I mean, Nitschke is not being ushered out of the movement. He is a respected member of that movement. Now, a lot of people don't go that extreme, and a lot of people, don't want to be as candid as he is. But that's where you end up, even if that's not what you intend, because you've defined killing as a splendid way to end suffering, and suffering can't be limited to the few conditions. And you've actually seen, this is really radical individualism or radical libertarianism. The Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court in Germany, created a fundamental constitutional right to suicide for any reason, not based on health, not based on disability, but any reason. It said there's an ancillary fundamental constitutional right, a human right in their opinion, to have someone assist you if that's what you want, and another ancillary right to assist. So while they did not legalize euthanasia in the lethal jab sense, they did basically say that, all this issue about health and disability and so forth is baloney. What matters is that you have a right to be dead. And if you have a right to be dead, then and to have help in making yourself dead, then we're in a different society. And we're no longer an anti-suicide culture. We're pro at least some suicides. And that's really dangerous for weak, vulnerable, despairing people. And it leads to the objectification of people. For example, now people who are getting euthanasia are seen as splendid sources of organs. Well, that gives society a stake in people being killed. And it may be the tipping point where somebody, let's say, has a mental illness, as in Belgium and Netherlands, and they have, the people with mental illnesses can suffer far more than people with physical illnesses. And they are now able to donate their organs right after being killed. So they go to a hospital, they're killed, they're wheeled into a room, and their organs are taken. In Canada, in Ontario, if somebody asks for a lethal jab and the doctor says yes, the doctor contacts the organ donation nonprofit organization that contacts the soon-to-be-dead patient asking for their livers and kidneys. I mean, it leads to the objectification of people. There was a case in the Netherlands, which I think is a terrible case. A 16-year-old girl had brain cancer. She had a very dire prognosis. Well, she asked for euthanasia at a particular time, she said, so that her organs could be donated. She wanted to do some good with her illness. At that point, she ceased to be, in my view, a subject and became an object, because what they did is they put her into a 36-hour coma. The coma wasn't for her benefit. It didn't do anything to help her. It was so her organs could be tested, her blood tested, and so forth, and suitable recipients found. So she became, if I can put it crassly, an organ farm, instead of someone who would receive preventative action saying, we understand why you're afraid. This is a terrible disease, but there are things we can do to help. We can ameliorate symptoms and so forth. So it's a very objectifying, dehumanizing thing to do when you authorize private killing in that fashion.
There's something quite sinister about it too, I would argue, because the language that's used, you touched on compassion earlier. Literally the Latin root cause is to suffer with, as you pointed out. And yet it's been misused deliberately now by pro-euthanasia advocates. Here in New Zealand, Wesley, we have newspapers celebrating people being euthanized on beaches, and it's an amazing, compassionate act. But we're also about
euthanasia parties also, right? Where people come and we gather and so forth. And the media and I think the popular culture with movies and so forth have done a terrible disservice to people, focusing on these stories deeply, because they really want us to feel and not to think.
Mhm.
And that's a problem of modern life. Too much feeling, not enough thinking.
Oh, amen to that. I have to say, I have to admit, it drives me bonkers. I often say to young people when I'm giving talks, I'm not particularly interested in what you feel. I want to know why you feel what you do. You need to be able to articulate
And
it.
why you think. When we say, well, I feel this, I feel that, we all do it. You should be saying, no, I think this, I think that, unless you're expressing love or something. Because thinking is a particular human attribute in the sense we're talking about rational thought. Feelings are, animals feel, of course. My dog wakes up in the morning and kisses me like crazy licks me because he loves me. I know he loves me and I love him, but he doesn't think in the way humans do.
No, and speaking on that thinking side, these logical inevitabilities, which again I'll use that word sinister, they're there. Once you open the door to euthanasia, as we've touched on, it expands wider and wider. And then you mentioned organ donations. New Zealand's exploring that at the moment. They've got the guidelines. They won't tell us how they've been drafted or by whom, but you have a logical inevitability there that some human lives are going to be only valued for what they're going to contribute to someone else. But it just seems very difficult.
Objectification. I wasn't aware New Zealand was doing that, and I would appreciate when you have time if you could send some information to me about that.
I'll definitely do that because we're exploring that here at Family First at the moment. News came out very quietly last year, and so trying to work out who's behind this, because we will end up in those tragic cases that you just explained coming out of Canada. And I think too, Wesley, we'll see again the language of compassion and kindness being wrapped around this when it's completely the opposite.
But it's utilitarianism, and they're giving society a utilitarian stake. John doesn't want to live, but his liver can help Pete. And that can be a very seductive argument. But why don't we, instead of doing that, help John want to live? And say, we can't give you the lethal jab, but here's what we can do. And try to include people, try to help them get past the darkness. I've seen it again and again in my work that can work. It doesn't always work, but it certainly can work. But we don't try because, he wants to die. That's his choice. He's controlling the time and manner of his death. It's death with dignity. Okay, it's death with dignity. Then my mother who died of Alzheimer's and my dad who died from cancer, are you saying they didn't die dignified because they died naturally? This is a very insidious trap that we can fall into.
I think the other thing too is often when I'm having these discussions and debates with people, they always think that they're John, not the Pete. In other words, they're the person who's going to be receiving the liver, not the one giving it over. They don't seem to think it goes both ways eventually if this utilitarian mindset continues.
Sure.
And it probably reflects my politics a little bit here, but if you do end up in a utilitarian space, it all comes down to power. Who has the power? And all these fundamental human rights, the rules of law that we have, fall by the wayside.
People think it's their own choice, but you talk to disability rights activists who are not generally speaking conservative. They're not generally speaking theistic in terms at least of their advocacy. And again, I'm speaking generally. They're generally not pro-life when it comes to abortion. But on this issue, they're very clear. They don't believe in assisted suicide euthanasia because they become the targets and it makes them less than equal. And so anybody who might say, well, I want to talk to somebody who's really on the left on these issues. The disability rights folk tend to be that way. And I've always felt that opposing euthanasia and assisted suicide should be a liberal in the sense of politically liberal or progressive avenue of approach, because liberalism, at least the liberalism I grew up with, was about protecting the vulnerable. It wasn't about exploiting them.
I was in Parliament, Wesley, for 12 years when the euthanasia law in New Zealand was passed, and as you would expect from this conversation, I fought very strongly against it. But you've nailed for me a couple of aspects here that happened in New Zealand, that some of the best allies we had were in the disability sector. As someone who's quite conservative in the best sense of the word, strong allies in the disability sector who would disagree with me on just about every other topic. And then great allies on the left of Parliament, that traditional left voter who says, no, we're here to support and care for the vulnerable, not the right wing, let's remove them because they're a cost to the state. It's funny, strange bedfellows in these bioethical arguments at times.
Sometimes, and it's very important if you have a pro-life audience. I've talked to some pro-lifers before, not that many, but too many to let it go, who said, well, if they're not against abortion, then I can't work with them. I'm thinking, why? You know, if people have differences on abortion, when you're dealing with abortion, work on abortion. But assisted suicide, euthanasia is different. And so, you know, work with people who will help you defeat that death agenda. Because once you do this, it's not going to stop here. You're going to end up eventually with something that is sometimes discussed in bioethics, a duty to die. Perhaps not a legal duty to die, but people thinking they have a moral duty to die. And if people are interested in that kind of topic, just do a search of that, and you'll see article after article that comes up arguing that in some of the most prominent bioethics journals in the world.
Again, it's a logical conclusion. I mean, I don't have your depth of expertise, but I've got enough to sit back that, again, once you open these arguments, or rather pursue them, the right to life becomes a duty to die. And it's frightening, absolutely frightening. But I worry, and I don't know if you have insights here, it's how to get these arguments, if you will, into popular discourse. And it's touching on a little bit of what you said earlier around feelings versus thought. The slogan catches the media's attention. The more considered opinion does not.
That's a challenge that I've been facing for 30 years because the anti-side stories don't stick as well as the pro sides do, because you might show a person who wanted assisted suicide and actually asked the doctor for it and then changed their mind and are happy to be alive. And you say, look at this. If she had actually gone to the doctor 2 weeks earlier, she might be dead. And they'll say, well, she's not dead. People just refuse to see it. But if they show somebody, in fact, there was just a case reported in one of our network television programs, news programs, of a woman with ALS, motor neuron disease, who was so happy to have an assisted suicide. And her family said, well, we never tried to talk her out of it. Well, you know, if my mother, when she had Alzheimer's, had come to me and said, you know, this is very difficult, which it was, maybe I should just have assisted suicide, which was legal at the time in California. And I had said, well, Mom, it's your choice. It would have confirmed every worst fear of hers, even though I might have thought I was being loving and trying to not be judgmental and so forth. And which brings up another issue your listeners and viewers need to consider. You may be invited to one of these suicide parties or euthanasia parties where they'll say, please come and you know, Aunt Mary wants to say goodbye, and she's going to receive the lethal jab or the lethal pills next Tuesday. So would you please come? And now you're in a conundrum, because if you say, well, no, I'm sorry, I'll do anything for Aunt Mary, but I won't validate and be complicit in her being killed or committing suicide, then they'll say, but Aunt Mary helped put you through college. How can you abandon Aunt Mary? And if you go, then you're telling Aunt Mary you're right. You know, your life isn't worth living. So people, and I hope priests and pastors need to think about that, because that's going to be happening more and more. And it's going to be very rough for people to say, all right, you know, I can't do this. I can do other things, but I can't do that, because then you might be the one ostracized by the family. In fact, there was a case here in the States back in the 90s, back when Jack Kevorkian was assisting suicides from his rusty van, where people would fly to the state of Michigan and he would hook them up to carbon monoxide. Are we going to say carbon monoxide is a medical agent? Give me a break. And there was a man with Alzheimer's named Klooster, Dr. Klooster, and a young man named Chip, the son, discovered that Mom was going to take Dr. Klooster to Kevorkian. And so the son went and asked his dad to come with him and took the dad into his own custody. And that led to a 1-year battle. And guess the man was eventually saved from assisted suicide, but guess who was excluded from his family from then on? Chip Klooster, because he saved his dad's life.
This is for me, there's sort of a bit of a theme, well, many themes running through today, but it's these logical consequences that, again, once we start moving away from human exceptionalism, once we move away from understanding ourselves as moral creatures with innate dignity, all of these absurdities begin. And I've never been able to articulate this as well as I'd like, which means I still don't have it fully in my mind, but it's the illusion of choice. So much of what we've been discussing here is, the pro-death advocates would say it's my choice. I get to choose. And yet they need the constitutional right of the German state. They need the rules here in New Zealand. They need family. They need the doctors. And I would argue that actually it's not an individual choice. They're always drawing people in to assist them. Therefore, it's not really the individual's full independent choice.
Well, somebody might want to burn themselves with cigarettes. Is that their choice? Somebody might want to say, in fact, there is a disease called body integrity identity disorder, where people become obsessed with being amputees or disabled. Should a proper treatment for that be to cut off the person's arm that they think is not really part of them? BIID. And we've actually seen some cases of that in Canada recently. A man who thought 3 of his fingers did not belong on his body had them amputated as a treatment for his condition. So once you start saying, well, all that matters is what I want, the great maw of I want, then there's no end to the destructive nature of the things that someone can want when they're not thinking correctly, or when they're in a deep despair, or if they have a mental illness, or if they're afraid, which we can totally all understand if they get a bad diagnosis. I had a friend, I was a hospice volunteer for a while, and one of my patients had motor neuron disease, and he told me, he said that for a long time he wanted to commit suicide, and then he said, I came out of the fog, and I was so glad to be alive. And he was really angry at the euthanasia movement, and in fact he wrote a piece called I Don't Want a Choice to Die for the San Francisco Chronicle, in which he said, you're trying to push me, and these were his words, are very close, you're trying to push me out of the well-lit boulevards into the dark alleys. And what really made him despair is when he was not included fully in life. So if people would come to his home and talk about him as if he wasn't there, it would drive him into deep, deep funk. But if he was included and made part of life, then he continued on and was very happy. He wasn't happy he had ALS, obviously, but he said it was a time in his life he wouldn't have missed. And hospice properly delivered, a lot of people say that.
Well, hospices are amazing, and a former life and career would volunteer and go in, and as you say, making those people valued is just, well, it brings them to the light. And the other thing I was struck with, having been around a few bedsides when people are close to death, is it's the family that are suffering. Not all in every case, but the family's suffering by watching a loved one die is often influencing their encouragement of that loved one to go. And you see that in the media when they're reporting, Jack and Mary were very upset to see their father dying of whatever. And you're going, okay, who's really suffering here? Is it the patient or the people wanting to get rid of the stuff? They don't want to see it anymore.
That can be putting the patient out of the loved one's misery. But you'll also see people who ask for assisted suicide that one of the reasons they might is they don't want to put their own families through the difficulty that is associated with watching somebody in decline. In fact, Brittany Maynard was very famous in pro-euthanasia activism. She was diagnosed with brain cancer. She moved from California to Oregon because she wanted assisted suicide. Because she was a beautiful young woman in a tragic circumstance, she kind of became the poster child for pushing assisted suicide, and I think her advocacy was instrumental in California, for example, legalizing it. But she wrote some articles, and she said, one, she was worried about her own suffering, and of course anybody would be. But the second thing is, she said she didn't want to put her family through that, to have them have a bad memory of her in decline. And that's a natural fear, but that can be alleviated. I mean, I remember my mother in decline, but that's not my memory of my mother. I remember my dad as he was toward the end in cancer, but that's not my memory of him. That has not cast any aspersion on the love I have had for them. So what we have to do is assure people that, you know what, we're in this together, and you're not going to be abandoned, and you're not a burden, and this kind of thing, and say, you know what, I understand, we're sorry you want suicide, but other than that, we're not going to do that, but here's what we will do. And you never just say no and then walk away, because, you know, we don't want people isolated. No one should die alone. We have a human obligation to each other, human exceptionalism, to care for each other, to look out for each other's welfare, and sometimes to value someone's life even when they can't value their own.
And we've also found through those moments that actually in helping, serving, caring for a loved one, and this shouldn't be the motivation, but in doing so, you're better for it as well. Your mum, your dad, whoever's suffering, you help them, but in doing so, you're benefiting as well. There's positives all around is probably the layman's way of trying to say it.
Yeah, I mean, I went through, like, you're absolutely right. I went through with my mother in particular. It was very difficult. We moved mom into our home for the last 6 months of her life, and she was experiencing sundowning, which dementia patients sometimes get after the sun goes down. For some reason, something really bad happens. And we had some difficult times. But I wouldn't have missed it for anything. I was taking care of my mother. And, you know, that can never be taken from me. And, you know, those were rough, difficult times, but they were important times. You know, life sometimes is hard, and that's as important as the fun times and the good times and the joyful times.
Well, that segues to a question that actually has been sitting in my mind as we're discussing, and it's the old philosophical one of what's the purpose or value of suffering. You know, we don't want to suffer, we don't like suffering, but it's very much part of the human condition. But the modern zeitgeist, the modern world wants to reject suffering. The moment there is any perception of it, and it's the same in New Zealand euthanasia laws, it's your personal perception of your suffering rather than anything objective.
Unfortunately, well, you know, I'm not, that's a little above my pay grade, but I do think that suffering is part of the human condition. Some of the most suffering times I've ever had were actually very important growth times for me. And I think the human duty, we can never eliminate all suffering, except by eliminating the sufferer, I suppose, but now you're killing people. But we can mitigate it. And I think we have an obligation to reach out and mitigate suffering for people. Christian belief certainly has that as an aspect of it. So do most theistic beliefs. So does Buddhism, which isn't theistic. So, you know, having compassion, suffering with, being there with, is important. And some people can benefit tremendously from suffering experiences, and some people don't. Let's be honest. But you know, there's something more important than just me, I. There's entire general welfare of society and how we perceive each other as neighbors and friends and fellow human beings.
I've often tried to argue, often unsuccessfully, but we are individuals, but we are born into community, which is what I say now. We're born into relationships. So for me, that is the rejection of libertarianism, that very fundamentalist individualist, and it won't surprise some of the viewers, I'm not into a communal socialistic view too. We are individuals, but we are in community, and that behoves it, obviously, my rights to be respected, but also to respect that of others, because again, we're in community together.
Yeah, and there's always a dynamic tension between liberty and security and community, and there always will be. But it seems to me that what is the overriding fundamental purpose of society? If it's not to protect the lives of citizens, but to prevent suffering, then you're actually creating two different paths. If it's to eliminate suffering, you know, for a while, let's say you take two paths that have a 3 to 5 degree separation. For a while, you recognize each other. You can talk back and forth, but eventually I'll be in the United States and you'll be in New Zealand, because eventually the departure becomes so extreme that you no longer have the same society. If we want to have universal human rights, universal freedom, protect the vulnerable and the weak, we will not permit private killing as an answer to our difficulties. We will instead protect the lives of everyone as equals for as long as they're breathing, and then also take secondary measures such as making sure people get proper care, making sure people have proper companionship, helping the homeless, and so forth. Sometimes I get asked, well, we will euthanize animals. Why shouldn't we do the same for people? Well, let's look at the reason why we euthanize animals. Sometimes it's because we don't want to pay for the cost of their care. Sometimes it's because they are incontinent on the furniture. Sometimes it's because they don't have a home to live in and be cared for in. So if we really want to go down that road, then you're going to find yourself saying, well, homelessness is grounds for euthanasia, or being in poverty is grounds for euthanasia. Now, some of your viewers might be saying, oh, Wesley, no one would ever think that. Well, there was a study, a poll done in Canada shortly, a few years after they legalized euthanasia, and about 27% of the people polled said that homelessness was a good grounds for euthanasia, because it changes your mindset as a culture. And like a similar number said the same thing was true for poverty and mental illnesses and so forth. So you have to think about what these things will do to you as an individual, how you think, how you perceive each other. And I'm sure most people in New Zealand would say, well, no, I don't, we would never want to euthanize homeless people. Well, now in Canada, apparently 27% of the people say if that causes someone to suffer terribly and they're living in a tent and so forth, then perhaps we should give them the lethal jab. Well, at that point, you end up with a right to suicide for any reason you want.
Again, it's that logical conclusion that when you open up these concepts, particularly around death, it does spread. And I would argue it normalizes concepts. And we're struggling here in New Zealand at the moment of puff pieces in media, as I was indicating earlier, celebrating euthanasia. Oh, it's wonderful. Oh, exactly.
And then you have to look at the word engineering. The euthanasia movement has been word engineering since it started. In fact, the term euthanasia back in the 19th century actually meant dying in a state of grace, peacefully surrounded by your family. And the first word to be co-opted, if you will, was the incipient, what we now call euthanasia movement, which took that term, which means good death, and applied it to being killed. Now the term of art, when I started this work, it was death with dignity. Now the term of art is MAID, M-A-I-D, which means medical assistance in dying. And often they won't even say the medical assistance in dying part because they don't want the dying to be perceived. It's just MAID. It's a medical procedure. It's MAID. It's a euphemism. And it is intended to deflect from what is actually being done and what is actually being proposed. So anyone who is arguing about these issues should never use the term MAID. It is the nomenclature of choice for people who believe in the right of assisted suicide and of lethal jabs. And the reason they don't want to use euthanasia or suicide in the term is because people support it less when they see an accurate descriptive term used. And that's why they use the term MAID, M-A-I-D. And we shouldn't permit it because they don't have the right to control the language. But the minute they proposed that, the media all picked it up. And because the media generally is in the tank.
Exactly the same dynamics here, Wesley, and so far as our law is called the end of life choice, as if only through this piece of law people are making choices at the end of their life. But it's all very nice and soft and deflects, as you say, from what's happening. I recall as I was attempting to debate this in Parliament years ago, when I talked about assisted suicide, howls and cries from other, more pro-death supporting MPs being called up, told, it's offensive, upsetting language. And it's like, it's the reality. It's the reality of what's happening here.
They say, well, you're creating stigma. Well, no, you're you being accurate and descriptive. And sometimes if people have a negative attitude toward suicide, that might save lives, huh?
Exactly right. And it comes always back to where we started, that human exceptionalism, understand that each and every human being has innate dignity. And you've used the phrase rightly, universal human rights. It's what I've never understood in this euthanasia space, is that if they're universal human rights, everyone has them. Whereas euthanasia says, oh, we can allow the right to life to drop in your case. We're going to let you go. In fact, we the state will assist in your termination. So,
Yeah,
stuff.
it is actual state. It's the state giving its imprimatur to some suicides and to some homicides. Because remember, a lethal jab is homicide. It may not be illegal, so it's not murder, but it is homicide. It's one person killing another person. And that's very disturbing. And what you're beginning to see around the world is, well, it's all going to be doctors with a long-term relationship, et cetera, et cetera. Now they're saying that nurse practitioners and physicians' assistants should be able to do it. So it's not about the medical aspect. That's a cover for what's really going on. What it is about the death aspect. And we should not go down that dark road. We should always value everyone's life, and sometimes even when they can't value it themselves.
Well, here in New Zealand, Wesley, there's only a very few doctors who want to be part of this. In fact, the majority, over 90%, don't want to have a bar of it. We've had about 10 doctors who are making quite good money off it. This is the other irony. There's two ironies developing here. One is to terminate someone is fully funded. Palliative care and hospices in New Zealand are not. And the second is that because so few doctors and nurses want to participate, the Ministry of Health is now suggesting that their conscience rights should be overridden because the service must be provided by the will of the patient. It's quite scary.
You're making it a right to be dead, and since the state's not going to set up execution chambers, they're going to force doctors and others to do it. That already happens in Ontario, Canada, where after they legalized euthanasia, some Catholic doctors and other doctors who believe in the Hippocratic Oath brought a lawsuit saying we should not be compelled to take a human life. One would think that would be something that everyone could agree with. No one should be compelled, if they're not in the military following a legal order, to take a human life. But instead, the courts ruled that even though Canada's charter has a specific provision protecting the conscience, the moral conscience and religious conscience of every Canadian, the judge said, well, yes, that's a specific charter right, but people also have a right to any legal medical procedure they want. And so if a doctor doesn't want to kill the patient themselves, they have to do what's called an effective referral. And in an effective referral, the doctor becomes the procurer of the homiciding doctor, the killing doctor. So you have to find a doctor you know will kill for your patient. There's one doctor in, I think she's in Alberta, has killed more than 400 people. And in Canada, the last year recorded more than 15,000 homicides, medical homicides, euthanasia killings, making it the 5th leading cause of death in that country. It's very, very concerning because, and you see the color of my hair. The thing that shocked me more than I think anything else in this work I've been doing for 30 plus years is the enthusiasm with which so many in Canada embraced this agenda. It has been utterly stunning to me that they've gone from, allowing the terminally ill people with what was called a foreseeable death, which is a very liberal and open category, to now chronically ill people, people with disabilities, frail elderly people. People are asking for euthanasia in Canada because they can't, in the medical system there, they can't get oncologists in a timely fashion to fight their cancer. And yet it's still supported widely by the people. In 27, they're scheduled to allow mentally ill people to be euthanized, just as they do in Belgium as they do in the Netherlands.
Oh, I find it quite scary, but I found when I look at a lot of the life issues, doesn't matter if it's euthanasia or abortion, for me they're built on wrong thinking absurdities. And therefore, to maintain the argument, to maintain the illusion, things have to get more and more extreme. So I would argue myself that's what you see in the abortion space, certainly here in New Zealand, and you definitely see it in the euthanasia space. It's just got to get more and more extreme. It's got to be celebrated. It's got to be normalized to justify what is an absurd foundation. Otherwise, it can't stand. Scary, absolutely scary.
In terms of the euthanasia issue, again, the bottom line premise leaves no way to put the brakes on permanently, because once you accept the premise killing is an acceptable answer to suffering, then how do you prevent it from spreading and growing? And even people who may not want it that way when they start are real happy it gets that way when the slippery slope takes effect. But again, it's not slippery slope, it's facts on the ground. It is no longer I think contestable that that process will happen. The question is how long it will take.
Well, one final question, but it's slightly curtly, but it's trying to be positive, because obviously when we talk a lot of these bioethical issues and certainly euthanasia, it's a heavy topic. But what would be your encouragement to viewers here of how they can better assist? What could they do? Obviously here in New Zealand, but for people who watch around the world, what sort of the positive things people can do to try and change this culture of death, that I would call it? What could people be doing from your experience?
First, you need to engage it, and you need to be there for people. Human exceptionalism, again, intervening, helping people, compassion, suffering with. But don't think of it in terms of a policy winning or losing. If you're going to engage these issues, what you're really about is saving lives. And you can always save lives. In the abortion issue, the crisis pregnancy centers have saved many children from being aborted. The same thing may need to be applied, that same kind of concept, with assisted suicide and euthanasia, because if societies decide they want this, they're going to get it good and hard. But there should always be a remnant of people who don't accept it and who will reach out with the kind of services and interventions that can save lives. And I think doctors have an obligation to stand up against it and put signs, for example, in their offices, this is an assisted suicide free zone, because the doctor's authority is being harnessed to push this agenda. And I think the doctor's authority can be just as equally harnessed to resist it.
I'm pleased you say that. I do remember arguing actually that with the simplicity of how one can be terminated, your real estate agent or lawyer could do it, but they put the cloak of medical care around it. But I wanted to end on
it's not a medical treatment.
No.
I mean, Jack Kevorkian was a doctor, but he applied carbon monoxide to people to help kill them. Was that a medical treatment? Give me a break. Killing is not a medical treatment. And even from 500 years before Christ with the Hippocratic Oath, physicians, at least the Hippocratic school, understood that.
What was the first principle? Primum non nocere. First of all, do no harm. But that seems to have been forgotten. But I wanted to end, as you have, on a positive, which is encouragement for people to actually embrace that human exceptionalism that you have written and spoken about so often, and understanding that important dignity and morality of our human nature. So Wesley, I am exceptionally grateful and honoured, as I said at the start, to have you come on the show. So thank you so much for your time, and hopefully we can get you down here to New Zealand sometime.
That would be great, Simon. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.